Hey everyone, I'm Bebster01 and welcome back to another Honkai Star Rail video. Today we'll be diving deep into one of the most important aspects of account investment for players who are looking to get the absolute most out of their teams, Eidolons. In particular, I'll be focusing on the best early Eidolons to pull for as of version 2.7. We'll break down why these Eidolons are so strong, how they synergize with the character's kit, and whether these upgrades are strong or just straight up broken. Before we get started, remember that Star Rail is ultimately about having fun with the characters you like. While some early Eidolons are objectively meta-defining or even broken, you should never feel forced to pull for them. Invest your pulls in characters who you actually want to play. That said, if you want to be as efficient as possible, this video will serve as a guide to understand which Eidolons provide the most value to your account. We'll be going through the characters in order of their release dates, starting with standard 5 stars, then moving through the limited 5 stars as they were introduced. Also, if I sound different in this video, that's because I'm super sick right now, unfortunately. With everything being said, let's jump right into the video. Let's begin with the standard 5 stars that have been with us since the start. Clara benefits considerably from her early Eidolons. At E1, using her skill will not remove marks of counter on the enemy. This might sound minor on paper, but it's actually a huge quality of life improvement for her kid. Clara's skill is a major source of her damage profile, and so are her counterattacks through Svarog. At E0, using her skill would remove any existing marks of counter, meaning Svarog wouldn't launch counterattacks on enemies that would have been marked. Now, at E1, she can use her skill without any drawbacks, ensuring consistent counterattacks and smoother, more reliable damage output. Moving to her E2, after popping her ult, Clara's attack increases by 30% for 2 turns. Since Clara's main source of damage comes from her enhanced counterattacks after using her ult, getting a big attack boost helps maximize that damage over the next 2 turns, further increasing her overall damage output. Bronya, another standard 5 star, also gains valuable improvements from her early Eidolons. At E1, using her skill has a 50% fixed chance of recovering 1 skill point, and this effect has a 1-turn cooldown. One of Bronya's biggest downsides at E0 is that she is extremely skill point hungry, which can hurt rotation efficiency. With E1, she eases that skill point burden, making it much less taxing to spam her skill. At E2, when using her skill, the target ally's speed increases by 30% after taking action, which lasts for 1 turn. Her buffs normally only last for a single action, but now you're adding a turn-long speed buff on top of her existing buffs. This extra speed means allies cycle through turns faster, boosting team DPS and letting you get more value out of your damage dealers. Moving on to limited 5 stars, we first have Silverwolf. Her E1 is all about energy regeneration. After using her ultimate to attack enemies, Silverwolf regenerates 7 energy for every debuff that the target enemy currently has, up to 5 times in each use of her ultimate. One of Silverwolf's biggest drawbacks is her high ultimate energy cost and her relatively slow energy recovery at E0. Her E1 solves all of her energy problems by granting a huge amount of energy whenever she ults, allowing for more consistent defense tread uptime and skill point positivity through having to skill less often for energy. This Eidolon is a fantastic pickup for Silverwolf, but she isn't doing the best right now meta-wise, so it's ultimately up to you if you think you will get value out of it. Kafka's relevant early Eidolon is her E2. While Kafka's on the field, dot by all allies increases by 25%. Although the dot archetype is basically forgotten by Huohuo at this point, Eidolons like Kafka's E2 keep it from falling off completely. This is a huge buff for all allies' dot damage, breathing some life into teams that rely on these effects. If you've already invested in a dot team or plan to in the future, Kafka's E2 makes that investment even more worthwhile. Next, we have Heng IL's E2. His E2 is considered game-changing, and for good reason. After using his ultimate, Do's action is advanced forward by 100% and he gains 1 extra skill stack. This is our first actually broken Eidolon in the video, as it almost makes him a completely different character. At E0, Do has long been overshadowed by newer DPS units, but at E2, he can comfortably compete with many of the current strongest DPSs in the game. A 100% action advance is massive for any DPS character, effectively granting him a free seal resurgence every time he uses his ult. It skyrockets his overall damage output, allowing him to keep up in the modern meta. Xuan, a preservation character focused on sustaining the team, sees her E1 turn her into more of a pseudo-harmony character. With E1, the knowledge effect increases crit damage by 30%. Xuan's matrix already grants allies a 12% crit rate buff, and adding a 30% crit damage buff on top of that is a generous damage buff to any DPSs in your team. It's icing on the cake since her primary role is to sustain the team, and any additional buffs she provides just push her utility that much further. Topaz at E1 provides an incredibly valuable buff for follow-up attack teams. When enemies afflicted with Proof of Debt receive follow-up attacks, they will enter the debtor state. This can take effect only once within a single action, and the Deader State increases the crit damage of follow-up attacks inflicted on these targets by 25%, stacking up to 2 times. The description is really long, but what it boils down to is just a consistent 50% crit damage buff for all allies and follow-up attack teams. If you run Topaz in such teams alongside DPSs like Feixiao or Ratio, this is a really nice Eidolon to have and a noticeable DPS boost. Huohuo's E1 is all about maintaining full talent uptime while remaining skill point positive. At E1, the duration of Divine Provision produced by the talent is extended by 1 turn. When Huohuo possesses Divine Provision, all allies' speed increases by 12%. Without E1, Huohuo would have to sacrifice either skill point positivity or full talent uptime, since she can't achieve both at E0. Extending the talent's duration fixes this issue and grants basically a permanent speed buff, making her rotations feel much more fluid and efficient. Our next broken Eidolon, and the first instance of a broken Eidolon for a Harmony character, is Ruan Mei's E1. While her ult is active, the damage dealt by all allies ignores 20% defense. Ruan Mei is already an incredibly powerful Harmony support at E0, and her E1 just makes her even stronger. Defense Ignore is one of the strongest buffs in the game, and combined with Ruan Mei's already incredible buffs, her damage amp capabilities skyrocket. This is an Eidolon that turns great teams into absolute monsters. You will begin noticing a trend in the increasing frequency of broken Eidolons from this point onwards, as we are now entering version 2.0, where power creep and especially Eidolon power creep become increasingly noticeable. Black Swan's E1 is the main reason why the Dot archetype is still surviving today, as it is an absolute game changer for Dot teams. While Black Swan is active in battle, enemies afflicted with Wind Shear, Bleed, Burn, or Shock will have their corresponding Wind, Physical, Fire, or Lightning res reduced by 25%. She is already a powerful debuffer at E0, and with an additional 25% Res Shred on top of all the debuffs she already applies is insane. Res Shred is an incredibly powerful debuff. It's more easily accessible for Dot teams than Kafka's E2, and it benefits more than just Dot teams, making it a universally great Eidolon. Sparkle's E2 is similarly broken, providing allies with massive defense ignore buffs. Every stack of her talent's effect allows allies to additionally ignore 6% of the target's defense when dealing damage. Her talent can stack up to 3 times, meaning Sparkle can grant allies up to 24% defense ignore, which is crazy strong. Combined with the crit and damage buffs she already provides in her base kit, her E2 makes her an overpowered hypercarry support. Like Ruan Mei's E1, this is the kind of early Eidolon that can redefine what a character brings to the team. Acheron's E2 is another broken Eidolon that fundamentally changes how you play her. The number of Nihility characters required to activate her trace, the Abyss, to achieve its highest possible effect is reduced by 1. When her turn starts, she also gains 1 point of Slash Dream and inflicts 1 stack of Crimson Knot on the enemy with the most Crimson Knot stacks. Similar to Dill's E2, Acheron's E2 completely changes how she is played. The Abyss is a super powerful self-buffing trace that increases her damage by 160% when she has 2 Nihility teammates on her team. However, this means you can't run powerful Harmony supports like Sparkle or Sunday unless you want to risk running a sustainless team. However, Acheron's E2 overhauls this mechanic by reducing the trace requirement to only 1 Nihility ally, meaning you can now run a meta Harmony support to make her damage skyrocket. If that wasn't enough, this Eidolon also helps Acheron accumulate stacks for her ult much faster. Her ult is unique in that it charges based on stacks instead of energy like most characters, and this Eidolon helps Acheron unleash her ult much more frequently. Aventurine's E1 is our first not game-changing, but still strong Eidolon in a while. It increases crit damage by 20% for allies protected by his shield, and after popping his ult, allies receive another beefy shield. This is similar to Fu Xuan's E1 in that it provides a really nice crit damage buff, which is always appreciated, especially on a preservation sustain character who's mainly there just to keep your team alive. Although Aventurine is already a super strong shielder at E0, the extra safety net when using his ult makes him even more comfy to play. Robin's E1 is quite possibly the strongest early Eidolon in the entire game so far. Her E1 grants a 24% res pen buff to allies, which might sound simple on paper until you realize res pen is an even stronger buff than defense ignore, which we already discussed previously how strong that is. Robin is already arguably the strongest E0 Harmony character in the game, and the additional res pen from her E1 backs up that claim. Both of Firefly's early Eidolons are incredibly broken and fundamentally change the way she is played. Her E1 solves her skill point negativity, her most glaring issue at E0. Her E1 makes her enhanced skill, which happens to be her primary source of damage, not consume any skill points. If that wasn't enough, It also grants her enhanced skill 15% defense ignore, which we already know is busted. Defense ignore is a buff that gets exponentially better the more you stack it, making her synergize incredibly well with E1 Ruan Mei and other broken defense ignore Eidolons, which we will cover later in this video. Firefly's E2 is just as broken as her E1 and operates very similarly to Dill's E2. She gets a free turn whenever she defeats or weakness breaks an enemy while in her enhanced state, and just like Dill, we already know how strong an extra turn is for a main DPS. Jade's E1 is extremely impactful for her specifically, though it might not be as impressive in the context of the current meta since Jade herself isn't the strongest character. Her E1 makes her follow-up attack damage from her talent increase by 32%. After the character with a debt collector state uses an attack and hits 2 or 1 enemies, Jade additionally gains 1 or 2 talent charges. This Eidolon significantly improves Jade's versatility by solving her biggest weakness at E0, needing to be paired with another Erudition or AoE character to accumulate stacks at a reasonable rate. Without this Eidolon, Jade is basically limited to pure fiction since Erudition DPSs aren't the strongest currently. With her E1, she can stack her talent when played with any DPS, opening up many more team comps and increasing her viability in other endgame modes. The follow-up attack damage bonus is also very welcome and helps boost her overall performance. Jiaoqiu's E1 further enhances his debuffing capabilities as a Nihility character. Allies deal 40% increased damage to enemies afflicted with Ashen Roast. Whenever inflicting Ashen Roast on an enemy target through his talent, his E1 additionally increases the number of Ashen Roast applied by 1. Ashen Roast is part of Jiaoqiu's talent and is a stacking debuff that increases the damage taken by enemies afflicted. Jiaoqiu applies Ashen Roast very quickly, meaning that the 40% damage vulnerability debuff is basically permanent. Additionally, this Eidolon helps him stack Ashen Roast even quicker, making enemies take even more damage. Feixiao's E2 is yet another example of a broken Eidolon that dramatically improves performance. For every follow-up attack launched by her allies, Feixiao gains 1 stack towards her ult, which can trigger up to 6 times per turn. Feixiao is similar to Acheron in that she charges her ultimate with stacks rather than energy. Normally, she only accumulates 0.5 stacks per ally attack, but her E2 doubles that charging speed in follow-up attack teams. Considering Feixiao's ult is one of the most devastating attacks in the game, this Eidolon drastically speeds up the rate at which you can nuke enemies, making Feixiao a powerhouse in follow-up attack teams. Lingsha is hailed as the Robin of sustainers, and for good reason. Especially in break teams, not only can she comfortably sustain her team, but she also provides immense break effect buffs to allies and dishes out impressive personal damage. Lingsha's E1 increases her weakness break efficiency by 50% and reduces weakness broken enemies' defense by 20%. With E1, her team buffing capabilities skyrocket and increase her versatility to teams outside of break. I don't need to explain again why defense shred is such a broken debuff, and having the same amount of defense shred as Ruan Mei E1 on an abundance sustainer is disgusting. Finally, Sunday's E1 continues the trend of unbelievably strong early Eidolons. When Sunday uses a skill on an ally, they ignore 16% and their summon ignores 40% of the enemy's defense. Much like his sister Robin, Sunday has one of the strongest E1s in the game. As I probably explained 100 times by now, defense ignore is one of the strongest buffs in the game, and Sunday's E1 provides a ton of it. The base 16% defense ignore is already a decent buff, but when paired with summoner characters like Jingren and upcoming Amphorius characters, the 40% defense ignore for summons is completely game-breaking. His E1 essentially future-proofs your account for 3.0 and onwards, as the summoner meta is inevitable with the introduction of the Remembrance Path. And there you have it, the best early Eidolons for 5 stars as of version 2.7. We've seen a clear trend. As time goes on, Eidolons have gotten crazier, with more and more characters receiving game-changing power spikes as early as E1 or E2. However, always remember that Honkai Star Rail is a game meant to be enjoyed. Don't let FOMO force you into pulling for Eidolons that you don't really want. At the end of the day, focus on the characters you love playing. Still, if you're looking to invest your pulls wisely, now you know which early Eidolons can provide massive returns on your investment. If you found this guide helpful, a like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated. Feel free to comment down below which early Eidolons you think are the strongest and if there were any that I missed. Thanks so much for watching, and keep spreading positivity.